Exploring Cypriot identity speaks loudly and collaboratively on issues important to all islanders, regardless of where you live, what language you speak, or what religion you may or may not practice. Co-founded by the five of us, we're artists and academics connected to Cyprus and its wide diasporas. Exploring Cypriot identity is an interdisciplinary collective group facilitating conversations about the pressing questions of identity. We discuss language, nationality, culture, literature, and very many more topics. Our intention is to meet monthly or bi-monthly in a public forum in which we and a series of revolving guests can open up dialogue on the past and future of being Cypriot. And this will always be followed by comments and questions from our diverse audience, and we encourage active participation from all of you here today and from all of you in the future. We're not affiliated with any governmental or political agency. We do not receive any external funding. We represent our own internal interests, much of which is grounded in our artistic, our creative, and our academic experiences. We explicitly include Cypriots of any background, including people who speak Greek, Turkish, English, Arabic, Armenian, or any other language. We welcome Christians, Muslims, a-religious people, and practitioners of other faiths. We will have an active social media presence, which is always growing, and we encourage anyone to ask us questions and to participate in our continuing series of events. We want to bring the silence about Cypriot identity to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I pass back to Aria.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So now just some housekeeping rules and guidelines. I want to kick this off by saying that we feels too bad to have to say this, but we do have a zero tolerance policy on hate speech. So this topic today centers around race. We want to make sure that everyone in the chat and otherwise is being respectful of everyone else's viewpoints. So please do so. And we will kick it off. We will have a few readings that relate to this topic today, interspersed throughout our structure. So we will kick off with a reading. We will then have a series of discussion items that I will be facilitating, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that you'd like shared, please drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to have them addressed directly, or at least have the subject area that that question is prompting shared with our panelists. And now we will also be sharing out resources that relate to this discussion today after the event, along with the recording. So give us a few days on that, but we will be sharing that out as well. And with that, please feel free to utilize the chat, not just for Q&A, but anything that you would like to respond to yourselves as well with the questions that I'm prompting the panel with. So thank you again for joining us. And I will now introduce each of our panelists. Anthony Anaxagoru is a poet, fiction writer, essayist, publisher, and poet educator and author of the poetry collection After the Formalities. Dr. Badia Kamal is a lecturer in contemporary and post-colonial literatures at the University of Kent and author of Writing Cyprus, Post-Colonial and Partitioned Literatures of Place and Space. Dr. Daniele Nunziata is a lecturer at St. Anne's College, University of Oxford, and author of Colonial and Post-Colonial Cyprus, Transportal Literatures of Empire, Nationalism, and Sectarianism. Ilaida Leto Agrotu Georgiou is writing her undergraduate dissertation on post-colonial literature at Cambridge University. Much of her research centers around the work of the panelists that join us today. So thank you all, both our panelists and all of you joining us for being here today. And now Badia will share a reading for us. Thank you, Badia.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, everyone. So I'm going to read from two different authors, Fikret Demirağ, and I'm going to read from his 4-volume book, Limlidi Ateşinden Bugüne. So from Limlidi's Fire Till Today. This hasn't been translated, so I've translated the work that I'll be reading here today. And I'm also going to be reading from Niki Marangoz's selection from the Divan that was translated by Stefanos Stefanides. So Fikret Demirağ. And whatever is in it, it's an island poet's initiated tracks with what he knows true from the sound of water. Icons and writings of Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, statues of Aphrodite, Mother Marys and Muharrams. Cypriot, our seeds are planted in you. A wind left us in your soil, and as it transpired, here we greened, we pruned, fertilized with your soil's divine hymn. So many ask for directions to another country, but is it not that our roots are in you, and wherever we go, our roots will carry a grain from your soil? So they can ask the plant spikes about us, ask the green and amber grains. There's no need for any tacha. Think, didn't this mother soil in its womb also feed you to germinate, bring you up? Wait, it is maybe a Doric's whisper that you hear in my voice, a poetic spell that drops from the voice of Aphrodite, Dionysus, Catherine of Corona, while vacillating the streets. Daytime, your Lusignan aunt's meaty lips are being kissed by the youth of your neighbor's Venetian son. Stop and ask after shovels and shovels of soil were thrown on top of all those hopes. Who are you now? From where do you start your journey? Which layered alluvial are you? Say time, what kind of dough, with what kind of dough did you complete me? Thank you. And I'll also just read, it's a really short from Niki Marango's, it's called At the Monastery of John Lampadistis. Figs red from blood of Frank, and John young and childlike. From Aleppo and Antioch, they came for healing. From Egypt came a cripple, bringing with him an Arabic book of navigation, a book of the sea called Bahriyeh, which spoke of roses of the wind and of times in Alexandria, when people killed over interpretations of some passage of Apocalypse. At night, the sick and the lame gathered round as he spoke of the other world, that he thought unchanging like the sea, and of all that the waves wash out in the winter, the bivalva, the Cypriot today, the Simia today, and the Vendra day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Badia. I will now pass, our first question, kicking off our discussion, is thinking about the position from which we each speak. How do you feel your experiences living outside and or inside of Cyprus have shaped the way you think about identity and race? How do you identify from a racial standpoint or otherwise? I will start by passing this off to Daniele, and I encourage all of you, as you feel comfortable and so moved, to share in the chat as well how you respond to this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Arina, and thanks, Badia, for those wonderful readings. I suppose with me getting things started, I'm going to answer in a kind of abstract way, think in more kind of general terms about the relationship between these concepts of race and imperialism and how we understand them today. As I see it, race is a social construct and one that was largely created by Western European powers in the 17th, the 18th and the 19th century, when those imperial powers, including the British Empire, were at their height. And I don't need to remind anyone here, of course, that Cyprus was part of the British Empire for a big stretch of its recent history. The very language of race, and I think that's important, thinking of race as something that's built into the language systems that we use. It's a linguistic construct. And much of that language that continues today was created in the 1800s in connection to imperialism. So there's a lot of figures we could bring in. Someone I've been reading about recently that's really interesting is someone called William Frederick Edwards. And he was born in Jamaica to British parents, and then he spent most of his life and a lot of his career working in France. So working between these two imperial powers, growing up in Jamaica, a colony of the British Empire. In 1833, the British Empire abolished the slave trade. A couple of years later, in 1839, Edwards coined the term, invented the term ethnological. And so there's this huge relationship between what's happening in the empire and the kind of the science, the pseudoscience, the language that's evolving in response to all of that. And this term ethnological was a way of studying, observing, measuring the so-called ethnologies and ethnicities of people across the British and the French empires. So race was constructed as a kind of language system, as a means of controlling colonized peoples through concepts of white supremacy, and that was used to justify mass colonization, genocide across the globe, and the enslavement of millions of people. And I think these ideologies span centuries. They've resulted in mass displacements up to and including those of the 20th century that have affected many of us here with our relationship with Cyprus. And it's all based around these ideas of race and ideas of white supremacy. So with the case of Cyprus then in particular, one of the things that I've been interested in terms of my research and on a kind of a personal anecdotal level is how the British Empire understood the race of Cypriots. And as I see it, the British Empire, although highly confused about the status of Cypriots, existing in this place between three continents, between East and West, Orient and Occident and so on, the British Empire never viewed Cypriots as either white or as European. The empire often used the term Oriental, which then essentially meant Eastern. The empire viewed Cypriots as Oriental peoples, and they used these ideas of racial difference to justify the colonization of the island, the colonization that continues to have an impact on us today. So the colonization of Cyprus was racialized from the start. Some of the travel writers that I look at in my research, including people like Esme Scott Stevenson, she was describing the way in which she was the first European seen on the island, and in contrast she was using terms like wild people, primitive people, savage people, and Oriental people to describe Cypriots. So one of my issues with internalizing the idea that one of the kind of my core issues back up in all of this is the problem that comes with internalizing the idea that whiteness equals power or supremacy, and that's what was used on the imperial landscape. And I think we now need to radically deconstruct this violent myth. And part of that is to move away from wanting to identify with these categories of whiteness and the categories of whiteness that was complicit in the colonization of the island and then genocide and displacement across the globe, thinking globally. So I guess that's kind of where I'll begin in broad terms. I'll pass on to Anthony, I think.
Yeah, just to echo a lot of what Daniele said, I've also been really interested in racial taxonomies over the last decade, and it's fascinating to see how race is in a constant state of flux. Like, there's never been a period where certain groups of people have remained in that way. I think looking at Latin America in particular has shown the complexities of race and how they've played out. In regards to the Cypriot identity, I think there's two, from speaking with Cypriots in London and discussions with Cypriots on the island, there's two things that are at play. Most of the Cypriots I encounter don't feel white, if that makes sense, like a feeling of feeling white. And they have difficulty in that they look at their complexion and they say, how can I say that I'm not white when look at my skin? And then they say, but my brother's brown, you know, or my dad's brown skin, but I'm white skinned. And so this feeds into their sense of self. But I think what's really important to remember is that this isn't a phenotypic matter. This isn't a cosmetic, a superficial surface complexion matter. It's about colonized people who for a very, very long time have had a lot of different groups of people within their DNA. And everyone who does a DNA test from Cyprus is comes back with the same kind of astonishment. So I kind of feel that we have to make a distinction between passing and what you actually are. So people that pass for white, it doesn't mean they are white, because what happens is that you start to create like a kind of archetype around somebody's look, and then you create hierarchies within that. And Elira and Buddy are going to talk about that a bit later on, how these kind of systems play out. And so I kind of feel that if you look at the whole region of the Middle East and the Levant, you'll find people in Palestine with blonde hair and blue eyes. Does that mean they're not Palestinian because they have blonde hair and blue eyes? In the same way you go to Lebanon, it's the same thing there. And so I kind of feel that the way somebody presents, it shouldn't determine what they actually are. Or you go to Puerto Rico, you go to Venezuela, places like that. In fact, 75% of Puerto Ricans identify as white, which is really interesting considering the history there. So yeah, I think that's my main thing that I kind of find myself talking about, is that when it comes to understanding who we are, don't look at who you are in the mirror or the complexion of your skin and allow that to determine what part of the world you come from.
Great, thank you, Anthony. And now, Buddy, I think you had a few words to say as well.
So for me, in terms of positioning, the ways in which I position myself, I'd say that I speak from what I would call a hybrid transnational and transhistorical positioning. And what I mean by this is that I speak from multiple positions. And for me, it's very much determined about the literatures that I read. So earlier, that Fikret Demiral's poetry and that volume speaks about 2,000 years of Cyprus history and the ways in which he as a Cypriot and Cypriots have lived, breathed, and become within and through these 2,000 years. So I identify with these spatial palimpsestic layers. I identify with that Doric voice and spirit of the ancient Greeks, the stones of Hirokitia and in the Neolithic, the kings of Cyprus, the statues of Aphrodite. I identify with the women of Lefkara who sewed the crochet, the influence that's said to have influenced Leonardo da Vinci, the Lusignan, the Venetians, Catherine Cornaro, the Ottoman, also the nationalist narrative. So that notion of the Ottoman blood pouring into Cyprus, I identify with that. That's a piece of me, as is the ancient Greek layers and the British hurricane and the shadow that has come about as a result of their colonialism, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And as a result, I guess what I've come to call this is a post-Lino Bambaki hospitable position that is actually extends from the Ottoman moment. The Lino Bambaki was a group that's extinct now, that negotiated between being a Greek, Orthodox Greek and being a Muslim Turk, and they would negotiate between them. And I define myself as a post-Lino Bambaki, and I hope that many Cypriots would as well, where it carries multiple positions, that I speak from multiple positions that carry the weight of both my diasporic experience here in the UK and my Cypriot experience within the colonial, post-colonial and partition moment. It's a positioning that enables me to cross ethno-religiously, as well as cross-culturally and cross-transnationally to capture and produce multiple Cypruses and multiple Britons. That's beyond just the binary. And again, like I said, there is an element of living inside and outside of Cyprus, but for me to be able to speak and fill this position has really come about through our amazing and the amazing literatures of Cyprus, which I would encourage everyone to definitely delve into, because there's some beautiful works out there that can shape an alternative Cyprus and an alternative being of Cypriot. Thank you, and I'll hand you.
I think she muted herself prematurely. Elida, I know you're taking the next question first, but did you have anything you wanted to say on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, hi everybody, that I am, I think, yeah, the only person in this group that is Cypriot raised in Cyprus. So I will be tackling a lot of the questions from that perspective, because I know it is also a perspective that I find diasporic Cypriots are very interested in, how we view race and racialization in Cyprus. I have more to say in other questions, but that will be the angle I will be examining the census and the depictions.
Great, thank you. So our next question, and I'll be dropping this in the chat as well, so if you want to follow along, keep an eye out in the chat. The census has been carried out in England and Wales every decade since 1801, with the exception of 1941. What does it mean when the country that once colonized us and subjugated us on ethnolinguistic and religious terms determines our identity with a box? How does the legacy of colonization determine our understanding of Cypriot identity, and how can we be disruptive to this process? And Elida will kick us off here.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with colonization is sometimes we think of it as a historical phenomenon that happened years ago that, you know, has not much relevance to everyday life. But from my research, I found that a lot of the uncomfortableness and a lot of the suspicion that Cypriots feel and navigate their own Cypriotness is linked to colonial narratives that were imposed on Cypriots during the British imperialism's inception, and even before that, because it's not like the British were the only ones who were weirded out and didn't exactly know what to make of the inhabitants of Cyprus. There is documentation since the Venetians calling us Oriental, weird, hybrid, dirty, and all those kinds of Eurocentric colonialist narratives and myths about the island. Something that I find quite interesting is a quote that was quoted down by Richard Storrs that was said to him by an officer working in Cyprus, talking about the Cypriot population. He said, I can understand a white gentleman and I can understand a Black gentleman, but these in-betweens and betwixts, I don't want to understand. And what really stood out in that sentence was the I don't want to understand, not I don't understand or I'm not quite sure, I don't want to know them. The idea that it is our presumed hybridity, are not belonging to one box or the other that repulsed the English so much and really disgruntled them. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we've all had a moment as Cypriots where we felt the consciousness of that hybridity and the consciousness of being in betweens and betwixts, as he terms us. And that uncomfortable feeling of being raised on narratives of Greece and Eurocentricity, at least for Greek-speaking Cypriots, and suddenly feeling this consciousness of another being or another mentality within us that stems from the colonial myths about us. And I think what's very interesting about the census is that the very people that have termed us as betwixt and in-betweens, subjugated us as betwixt and in-betweens, set up segregated areas on the island where Cypriots were not allowed to enter, such as the Gentlemen's Club in Lefkosia, are now telling us, well, you can choose the white box. And what does that mean about us having that choice after our history? I don't remember who I'm supposed to pass it on. Ariana.
It is me.
Perfect. Thank you, Elida.
So is it me now, yeah? Okay, lovely. Thanks, Elira. That was fantastic. And I think I've got quite a lot to also add in relation to what Elira just shared as well. So I'm particularly interested in responding to this question through thinking about census in Cyprus through the ages and focusing, like Elira just done, on the British legacy. And I'm interested in thinking about it as related to the partition motive of number games and name games that put us into numbers, graphs, and charts, which generated the deeply divided racial identity in Cyprus and the diaspora. So by number games, by name games here, it's referring to the rival system of naming people and naming places that operates between languages, religions, ethnicities, and traditions. So this is both a demographic and a cartographic compartmentalization that enables the namers to have total knowledge and power. namers and the names consistently change. So in example of Cyprus during the colonial moment, I'll just veer and focus on the British colonial moment. This game was between the colonizer and the colonizer, but it was predominantly the colonizers defining the Cypriots inconsistently, as has already been flagged up. So there was exactly what Ilera said in terms of a hybridization in a negative way. So Robert Young is a great theorist who points towards this negative idea of the hybrid identity. And the Cypriot was this hybrid thing that was neither Turkish nor Greek. And we see this in a lot of imperialist texts. So for example, the traveler William Dixon says this: except in name, they are neither Turks nor Greeks. We must clarify, he says, classify. Apart from creed, these are Cypriots and Cypriots, Cypriot dark, Cypriot fair, Cypriot horned, Cypriot oval. But these are Cypriots who are considered Oriental. This is also something that High Commissioner Malcolm Stevenson said in 1922. At heart, they are Orientals. At the same time, however, there was a shift because they were quite confused, that defined the Cypriots as Turks and as Greeks, as backward kind of othered Turkish Muslim and a more civilized Greek. And this figured predominantly through a number game. So what do I mean by number game? It's a rival system of numbers that compartmentalizes people and places, which is always under negotiation, and it's central to all partition narratives. And things like census recordings, map making, ideas of representative government are core. And what the British did is it was a mental and physical construction that carved up the people of Cyprus and the land into a numerical system. So again, enabling them to have total knowledge and power. The colonized people, the people of Cyprus, later appropriated these methods against each other as a weapon to obtain power. And they compulsively played with quantities, a game of majorities and minorities, giving way to define the human condition as something, and its geography as some kind of mathematical mental abstraction. And I just want to clarify by example, because this may sound quite abstract, what I'm saying here, in terms of the British Census. So in terms of the number games, the British between 1878 all the way through to 1885 were practicing creating a Cyprus through this operation of numbers. And it started with 1881, and the British completed the first comprehensive state census that divided the inhabitants into multiple columns, especially exploiting the difference and strengthening the binary between ethno-religious categories, ending, and I'm going to quote this because I think it's so important, ending in the total population being 185,630. Estimates 73.9% Christian Greek, 24, I'm exactly reading it from the census, and 24.4% Muslim Turkish. Now, why I feel the need to point to this is because this is one of the only estimates where the divided groups agree on numbers. After this moment, things go into out of control, which I'll just discuss shortly after. And as a result of this recorded number, the binary was solidified, disagreements over number games dominated. This was also the moment when the first ever comprehensive British map was drawn by Lieutenant Kitchener that converted Cyprus into numbers solidified by ethno-religious binary markers with a Muslim crescent and a Christian cross. This is quite important. Prior to this moment, the Ottoman didn't have this kind of method. For the Ottoman, it was difficult to do a census recording because with the Ottoman colonies, there was a wide array of population mobility. The only thing the Ottoman cared for was two columns. Was the column of the non-Muslim taxpayer and the Muslim who the non-Muslim taxpayer and the Muslim who didn't pay tax, and numbers were determined by households, not individuals. And there was also, prior to this period, lots and lots of different censuses taken by the French, the Greek ambassador, and so on. But as a result of this British moment and 80 years of colonial moulding, this left the group in total hostility with a minority-majority number game, especially, and name game, especially over a population statistics, where when you look at the numbers after this moment, and I could give you so many examples, but we could discuss if you want, the numbers never meet and they're completely different. 78.2, 18.4, it just becomes a complete and absolute number game, which generates the deadlock in Cyprus and did generate the deadlock. I just also want to add, in terms of an important way of thinking about census in the case of Cyprus as well, after the partitioning of the island, the 1974 partitioning, this gave way to a process where Turkish settlers came into Cyprus with soldiers and civilians, and the exact number of Turkish settlers is completely unclear. Many of them were issued citizenship, and there was no kind of control of census, and there still isn't. We don't know numbers. What we do know, I think, is that the Turkish Cypriot is a minority in comparison in the north. And then there is an element of census to think about in terms of Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots becoming citizens in the Republic of Cyprus and the census there. So what I'm pointing towards through this is that the British colonizers, through their number games and name games, and particularly through their census taking and their map making, generated this kind of competing narrative with a minority majority complex that generates a deadlock in Cyprus. And I would say, in order for us to be able to overcome this, is to know this history and know that this history made Cypriot people play these racial games against each other. And I would ask and struggle for and hope for us to stop playing these games and maybe veer towards something like that Lino Bambaki positioning that went extinct because of that British census that I marked earlier. They went extinct because the Brits said, you decide, you're either a Greek or a Turk, you're either a Muslim or a Christian. There's no room right now for this hybridity in betweenness. But subsequently in 1934, when the Cypriot, when there was an uprising in 1931 against the British, they turned around and tried to Cypriotize the Cypriots. So it's basically this, there's a lot of ambiguity. And I will stop there and hand you over to, I think, Danielle. Thank you.
Thanks, Badia. And yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Badia has just said so wonderfully, and everything that Elida was saying before. I think hugely important points for us to take on board. And yeah, I mean, I agree with the evolution of the census. In Ariana's question, there's the emphasis on 1801, the first British census, and then the first kind of attempt at an empire-wide census was in 1881, so only a couple of years after Cyprus was absorbed into the empire, a couple of years after Queen Victoria became Empress of India. And I would argue that there's a huge correlation there between empire building and the use of the census, and kind of thinking about that, the relationship between knowledge and power. For anyone kind of familiar with the philosopher Michel Foucault, he's someone who argues that to have power over someone or something, one needs to know that subject intimately well. And the census was a way of knowing subjects of the empire in order to exert power in the most efficient way, the most economically efficient way for the empire. So, I mean, I guess with my response to this question, I'll talk a little bit about the British census this year and recently. I think the census has come a long way from the 19th century. I think that's important for us to flag up, but we do have to constantly be wary about the inherent issues that go into attempting to monitor the demographics of a given place. Who's using that data? What is that data for? And how can we engage with that? Remember that, as Badia was saying, the British Empire was the force deciding how Cypriots should identify. There was no sense of agency among Cypriots themselves. Cypriots were never asked how they wanted their identities to appear in any of this official documentation. It never happened. And so the British Empire deciding all of that. So I think today in 2021, we need to take agency as people connected to the island of Cyprus over the way in which we identify, not census organizers in the United Kingdom and not other related bureaucratic systems on the island of Cyprus itself of which there are many. And I don't need to kind of flag up any of those for anyone here. We need to have that agency and that autonomy in controlling how we identify. Because of that, Exploring Cypriot Identity over the past couple of weeks started a very, very small campaign. Bear in mind, we've just established ourselves this year, so very much kind of grassroots level, but a very small campaign encouraging Cypriots in the UK to think very proactively about how they identify on the census, and inviting, encouraging, but not telling anyone how to identify, inviting, encouraging Cypriots to think about the kinds of terms they could use on the census. So we were putting forward the idea that Cypriots could use the term Cypriot on the census rather than other terms that could possibly be used by the Office of National Statistics, like Greek or Turk. And we also encourage Cypriots to think about putting their identity in a place on the census outside of the white box, essentially. The only place that can take place is the other box. And I think that there are kind of issues with the term other. It is unsatisfactory in certain ways. And I think we have to recognize that, bearing in mind the long colonial history of other. But at the same time, there's also the violent myths that are bound up in whiteness that many of us were talking about before. And it's really difficult to kind of get that balance right. So we were kind of encouraging Cypriots to put their identity forward, to give as much information as possible, to allow the Office of National Statistics, who are involved in creating the census, to consider finding a new way of allowing Cypriots and related communities to make their identities autonomous in future censuses. And so we're not trying to be prescriptivist, we're just encouraging people to think proactively about what they should write on the census and how what their decision to write on the census communicates something directly to the ONS about how we collectively identify. This kind of one of the sources of inspiration was the fact that in the previous census in 2001, that was the first time that the Arab category was first placed on the census. And interestingly, the Arab category is placed under the other category. So we're coming back to this suggestion that people from this part of the world, in quotation marks, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Levant, are constantly being circumscribed into these kind of colonialist terms about otherness. However, that Arab category came about in 2001 because people from Arabic-speaking countries, Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, i.e. some countries that neighbor Cyprus, campaigned directly to the ONS, spoke directly to the ONS about creating a space beyond whiteness and a space beyond otherness. So going forward, I would really like for us in some capacity, and I would welcome people to kind of join us to lobby so that for the next census or in kind of future documenting of identities, there's an even more open category for people from across the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond to represent themselves as accurately as possible. So this would be a category that would include Cypriots, but also include other groups like Armenians and Georgians and Azeris, Persians, Kurds, Druze, and maybe Arabic speakers who don't want to define themselves in ethnolinguistic terms. Remember, of course, we're talking about the issues about defining yourself in terms of a linguistic identity. I haven't had a chance to read all of the comments fully, just with everything going on, but there are so many people here who feel let down by attempts to force their identity into the white box. And there are people here saying that they identify as Mediterranean, they identify as Eastern Mediterranean in particular, they identify as Middle Eastern, they identify as Western Asian, which bear in mind is the term that the UN uses to describe Cyprus, interestingly. And we can talk about that another time. I've got a lot to say about that. There are people using the MENA term, MENA, Middle East and North Africa. And I think this is really interesting that many people feel the same way. There's inconsistency there, of course. There are many terms here. Which do we privilege over the other? But I think we need to have a kind of more conversations among ourselves, the kind of conversations we're having today, and then bring these conversations to those who are involved in, those with power, including the Office of National Statistics, and think about whether they can open up a Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, North Africa category, so that people, including us Cypriots, but also Armenians and Georgians and many other groups, can feel more adequately represented by the census and related documents. So I'll leave it at that. And if anyone has, anyone's interested in joining us with those kinds of projects going forward, just keep following us and get in touch. With that, I'll pass on to Anthony.
Was it for me? Was it supposed to be for me?
I don't think you need to answer anything if you don't want to, Anthony. I think we were planning just to go to the next question.
Yeah, the next
okay,
question.
sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for that, Daniele, so much, and for everyone. In the spirit of the rich multiplicity that the Cypriot identity reflects, that Daniele and all others were just referencing, I did look very thoroughly at the chat, and here has been what we've heard in the chat so far in terms of how people self-identify. Cypriot, white West Asian, Middle Eastern, Eurasian, Mediterranean, Black, hybrid, and with commentary, I would like to be in between without being other. I found that very powerful. A beautiful mix of beautiful races, more white than my family, less white than my white friends. And here's what I've seen in terms of how people have been labeled by others. Ambiguous, other, neither brown nor white, non-white, spicy white. Okay, moving on to the next question. What has the EU done to the Cypriot imagination? Badia will be kicking us off here.
So I'll just kind of point towards just two brief statements for us to think about. So I'd say that the EU has polished the binary between the Cypriots, has strengthened that binary between the Cypriots by defining, accepting, if you like, one side, and defining one side as the South, the Republic of Cyprus, as Western European, those who are Christian Greek, and then the Turkish people in the Turkish Cypriots in the north, the Muslim other who cannot be Western or European and who cannot be white. So the European Union as a construct has isolated and alienated the Turkish Cypriots from being anything but an unrecognized and non-existent thing. There's been an element of a kind of clear-cut binary polishing. But at the same time, there is an element of blurring as well, because the people of Cyprus, the Turkish Cypriots, as I mentioned earlier, are able to obtain the Republic of Cyprus passport. So this kind of disrupts that clear-cut binary that was constructed by the European Union. So that's all I'm going to kind of say here. I'm happy to discuss it further. And I'll pass over to, I think, Danielle.
I think Elida. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a lot to say about that, having grown up in the South and also being 4 years old, I think, if I remember correctly, when Cyprus was in the EU. So for 3 to 4 years of my life, I was not a European. And then suddenly I became one, which I think when you truly boil it down, that it's a very interesting phenomenon. But I remember, and I also remember reading that when Cyprus was accepted into the EU, bear in mind, it was accepted on slightly ambiguous legal terms, since it was supposed to be accepted as a unified country, and it wasn't a unified country when it entered. There were many banners by Greek-speaking Cypriots that said, "Thank you, Europe," on the banner. And I find that so interesting, because saying "thank you, Europe," for being accepted into the European Union, to me, betrays an insecurity about that status. And it makes me think, like, when you talk to other Greek-speaking Cypriots especially, and the country has done, as it does many times, something bad on the geopolitical stage, or something that we find embarrassing, we say the Europeans are going to come and fix it. We've embarrassed ourselves in front of the Europeans aren't going to like this. And so there's always this sense that the Europeans are this vague force of nature outside of our own control that will either scold us into obedience or ridicule us for not behaving correctly. And I think that boils down to the heart of Eurocentricity in Cyprus. It's wanting to assimilate into an identity we feel will correct us. So while I've seen also in the chat, and I've seen, I've heard many comments around the world that the Greek-speaking Cypriots fit nicely into that European identity. I would argue that actually we have a very fraught relationship with the EU, and that relationship stems from our desire to become Eurocentric and the EU's desire to keep us on the boundary, because it actually privileges the EU to have a Levantine EU member on the borders of the Middle East and Europe as defined, through colonialism, because it serves them in terms of transaction, it serves them in terms, as well as Malta, if something goes wrong in the EU, it serves them to have countries outside of the EU binary to determine that. And I think that's assimilated into us. Speaking on other ethnolinguistic groups, I can't speak from my personal experience, but I can say that, being Cypriot and having that Cypriotness being defined as European, when you don't speak Greek, or when you speak Turkish, when you speak Sana, which is Cypriot Arabic, when you speak Armenian, why are we, by aligning Cypriotness to Europeanness, we're excluding all of the ethnolinguistic identities. We're excluding ourselves as Greek-speaking Cypriots because we're not being honest to our history, but we're excluding and discriminating all the other ethnolinguistic identities that make Cyprus, that have intermarried with one another, that have always lived together. And I think that's where the EU does a real disservice to Cypriots and how they perceive their identity.
Thank you for that, Yelida. Unless anyone else has anything to say, feel free to speak up on the panel. We'll move on to our next question. How do the identity-based limitations offered by the census compare to the lived experience of many British Cypriots? What are the harms posed and or perpetuated by these limitations? And Daniele will kick us off.
Yeah, I suppose my views on this question relate to what I was saying before about the census, about its kind of possibilities and its limitations, the need for spaces in the census for Cypriots to represent how their lived experiences manifest in their day-to-day lives, and that's the kind of problem of Cypriots being subsumed into pre-established boxes. There are some British Cypriots in particular, when we're thinking about the UK census, who their lived experiences are defined by how they look, their names, the way they speak, the religion that they practice or they don't practice, sometimes their facial hair, and a lot of this can take the form of discrimination that comes from a kind of colonial inheritance of white supremacy, and it leads to things like denied job opportunities and promotions. I think all of us here have had experiences of talking to Cypriots who have been treated as second-class citizens, in contrast to white English, white Welsh, white Scottish, white Northern Irish people. And so I think it's important that the census does open up the way in which Cypriots can identify themselves, in order for it to be used as a tool to monitor discrimination that occurs rampantly in the United Kingdom, not just against Cypriots, but obviously that's the kind of topic of our discussion today. I think that's one of the few core benefits of the census, the way in which it can exist as a way of measuring not just people's identities, but discrimination that takes place in places like where we work and so on. And so I think that the census needs to do more to kind of monitor that discrimination, monitor the way in which British Cypriots can be discriminated against according to their migration status as well. Some of us obviously think about British Cypriots who were born here, but there's also Cypriots who have arrived in the United Kingdom and experienced huge problems because of their status, their citizenship status. Apologies for my inability to speak there, but that's something that's now increasing in this kind of post-Brexit world that we find ourselves in. And therefore the census can't just be something we do every 10 years where we just tick out some boxes that someone else has designed for us. Instead, it needs to be a tool that really tackles the problems that Cypriots and other communities face, including problems surrounding workplace discrimination, issues to do with migration and citizenship, as well as issues bound up in language and names and so on. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Daniele. And then I believe Badia had a few statements followed by Anthony.
Yeah, just I guess just thinking in terms of the harms by these limitations, I would just like to point towards the risk of extinction, and just pointing back to the Linobambaki community that were made extinct as a result of the census. And with the new census, it in terms of Cypriot, it thought about Turkish Cypriot, Greek Cypriot, but Armenian Cypriot, Maronite Cypriot, and the Roma Cypriots are completely erased. We always forget about the Roma in particular as well. So it's the harms, I would say, is mostly the fear, the significance of extinction is something I'd like to hold on to and point towards. And I'll just hand over to Anthony.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the things when we were kind of drafting up this conversation, one of the things we kept coming back to is, why is this important? Why is this important to us? And I think Yoda Dimitriou just mentioned the idea of privilege in the chat there, and I think it's, for me, and I speak on only for myself, but I think it's the idea of feeling seen, the idea of feeling truly acknowledged for who you happen to be. And I've always felt that if we try to pander to this idea of Europeanness or this idea of Greekness, which are synonymous most of the time, I think that's where a lot of Cypriots get their idea of those who do identify as white or as European. It comes from the Greek kind of, prefix, the Greek Cypriot, that is all tied into nationalism and things like this. So I think that by understanding how the census works and why it's important for people like us who fit in this kind of gray area, we don't fit neatly into the box, while we come forward and speak into it properly. And it doesn't, like looking at all the different kind of points of view in the chat, it really does, it makes me feel connected, because at least I know that I'm not the only one who wrestles with these things, and I'm just not comfortable fitting these kind of ticking these boxes. I never have been since I was a kid. I think very much in the UK, we are racialized by white people, by English people. Like, I was told from a very young age that I wasn't white. I think I was 11 years old when the kids at school said, "You're not white, you're from Cyprus." I had no idea what any of that meant. And that was the first time I had to try and get my head around these ideas. And so it didn't come from me, it came from somebody else. And Ibrahim Ekskende uses the term racial puberty, when you get to a certain age where you kind of become aware of who you are, but it's always in relation to somebody who is in a position of power, who can tell you who you are. I have a friend from Sierra Leone, and he says to me that before he came to the UK when he was 13, and he says to me that in Africa, in Sierra Leone, there's no black people. And when he first said this to me, I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he was like, "In Sierra Leone, you're an African. When you come to Europe, you're a black person." And that's the idea, is that blackness and whiteness are terms and ideas that were created by Northern Europeans, but they were also created in immutable ways. They were fixed. So people who don't fit these kind of binaries get left by the wayside. And Cyprus is a pure example of a group of people, as everyone has said on the panel tonight, that the British have never known how to think about us. And what's happened as a result is their confusion, we've internalized it. Not only have we internalized it, we've accepted it. And that's why everyone is all over the place, because most other groups of people, even Southern Europeans, they kind of know where they sit. Cyprus is a complete anomaly, and it always has been. And that's why we're having these conversations, 60 years later, because of the fact that the colonizer had no idea who they were colonizing. Whereas in other parts of the world, in other colonies, it was a lot more obvious what the agenda was. How are you going to come to the Middle East, yet find a group of predominantly Christian people? You can't impose religion on them, because they already are Christians for the most part, as the statistic that Badia was showing earlier. So they had no idea what to even do on the island. It is a really good book, actually. This one, Sweet and Bitter Island by Tabitha Morgan. If you want to read a good book on how the British did not have a Scooby-Doo what was going on in Cyprus, this is the one. Like, it's absolutely fantastic. And she's a British lady. And it just shows you, everything makes sense. Like, when you read this book, everything starts to very slowly make sense.
Thank you, Anthony. Did that come from an official review? They did not have a Scooby-Doo.
That's the London thing. Comes out every now and then.
So we've got 30 minutes left in our program. I'm very big on representation, making sure if you have any burning questions that they get asked. So please make sure as questions come to you, you put them in the chat. We may continue to incorporate them in our discussion as has happened, as our panelists are keeping an eye on the chat as well. We have a couple more questions we're going to do, then another reading, and then we're going to open it up to you all. So get your questions in and we'll make sure we have time to get to as many as possible. So our next question, why is racial identity in Cyprus and the greater diaspora such a fractured and debated subject? And Anthony, I know you just spoke, but if you have anything more you'd like to add to this, feel free. Otherwise, we'll hand it off to Daniele.
Yeah, I'll let Daniele. I've just done a sermon.
Yeah, take a breath.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, why is it such a fractured and debated subject? I mean, I suppose race is a fractured and debated subject in Northern Europe, and then those kind of fractures and those insecurities are internalized elsewhere across the world. And you know, I've talked about the empire a million times today, but it's through the empire that those ideas of race started off in London and Paris and were then projected outwards and internalized in different ways, internalizing Eurocentricity as well, the idea that being part of Europe and a very specific conception of Europe, the way in which that was internalized and associated with power and freedom, and particularly from 1960 onwards. So I suppose that's why it's fractured and debated with us today. Many of us are from the diaspora, thinking about those kind of questions about racial identity as they pertain to living overseas. As we were kind of setting up for today's group, I know that we kind of had plans for me and Ariana to think about this question also in relation to the fact that the two of us are you know, multi-ethnic. I mean, again, words are struggling to fail me, and so I'm part Cypriot, I'm part Italian, but born and raised in the United Kingdom, in London in particular, and so it's really interesting the way in which that then is something that I have to think about constantly, and I have to kind of grapple with. Often we talk about the kind of doubleness of a diasporic identity, for example, the idea of being both British and Cypriot, and in my case, and in related ways in Ariana's case, we have to think about three identities simultaneously and how we negotiate the three. And you know, it leads to, we talk about things like imposter syndrome at the moment. You know, there are many times where I don't feel British enough because all four of my grandparents were migrants / refugees who came to this country. I don't have those roots to the United Kingdom, and I see the United Kingdom from that point of distance, from that kind of Cypriot perspective where the UK was the centre of the British Empire. I don't have those roots to Englishness. So there's that kind of sense of not being British enough. And then because of those competing parts of my cultural identity, there are times where I don't feel Cypriot enough, I don't feel Italian enough. Am I one of those things, two of those things, three of those things? How do I negotiate all of that? And I think that's, you know, we're attempting to bring it up today because increasingly that's the case for many people. You know, there are people who are British and Cypriot, there are people who are American and Cypriot, but there are also people who are of a mixture of different cultures together. And on the island of Cyprus, you know, there are people who are Cypriot and Moldovan, Cypriot and Vietnamese, Cypriot and British and something else. There are British Cypriots who were born in the UK and then moved to Cyprus and bringing that into their identity. So identity is so complicated and fragmented. We need to discuss it. We need to think about it. If we don't, we're just creating these silences where people kind of go mad, not knowing where they belong, who they belong to, and who they are. And I guess with that, I mean, I've mentioned your name so many times, Ariana. I hope I haven't spoken kind of misrepresented you, but pass to you and to your related experiences.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniele. As you can probably tell from how I speak, I grew up in the US. I am 3/4 Cypriot. Both my dad was born and raised in Cyprus, and my mom is half Cypriot. And then the other half of her is Ukrainian. but I grew up going to a Greek Orthodox church, and we were kind of grouped into the greater Greek community because, you know, lack of choice. We only had a few other Cypriots in the small community that we grew up in. So while I was always told I was Cypriot in Greek school and otherwise, I would get grouped into being Greek. So that created kind of a mini identity challenge in and of itself. And then if you look at my parents, even though my mom's only half Cypriot, she actually has darker features than my father, who has red hair, light eyes, fairer skin than me. So often when I'm in Cyprus or otherwise, people, their first assumption is not that I'm Cypriot, it's that I might be British, I might be Eastern European of some variety. So that is also a challenge. And my papu on my mom's side was quite dark complexioned, and that is one of the primary grandparents that I grew up with. So I remember I grew up in a really diverse community. It was a third Black, a third Latinx, and a third white, more or less. So I had friends of all races and backgrounds growing up. One of my friends was of mixed race and primarily identified as Black. And we were really young. I was probably like 7 or 8 when I was having this conversation with her. And she was telling me, yeah, my dad's white, my mom's Black, I consider myself Black. And I just said matter-of-factly to her, oh yeah, my grandfather's Black, because I was just thinking about visually as a kid, how I saw the two of them looking so similarly. And she just kind of looked at me like, okay. So a lot of confusion. And that's really all I have to say about that. I grew up, my family had a restaurant when I was growing up, and growing up working in that restaurant, but then going on, you know, education was a big priority. So also the way I speak in terms of the education I've received, people often assume that I come probably from a more upper middle class background than I really do. And so that's another layer when you talk about privilege as well, and how complex that can be in the US. I saw someone who lives in New York City said in the comments that to be a Cypriot, at least as far as this person, you know, presents, and to identify as white in a place like New York City would be absurd. And I feel similarly. I live in Baltimore, I live in West Baltimore, I live in a predominantly African-American community. It would be, you know, my experience, I'm absolutely white passing. So that's how I treat myself, you know, and act accordingly, but to each their own and their own experience. And with that, I'll pass it off to Badia.
Yeah, I think in terms of the racial identity insight, why is it so fractured? It just goes back to what I've already kind of said in terms of the legacy of British colonialism, and thinking of the partition motive I discussed earlier, and the number games and name games. So by this, and I engage with this quite a lot in my book, that it's quite hilarious when you go into the archives and you look at the layers of representation where they just couldn't fix the Cypriot, and a back and forth between, like I said, they're this hybrid Oriental breed, neither Greek nor Turkish, and then they're suddenly shifting to define them as Turkish or Greek. And this gave way to that competing narrative between the Cypriots. But it also gave way to what I define and argue is being stuck in the decolonial moment. The people of Cyprus, I would argue, are stuck in the decolonial moment. By this, I mean, during the decolonial moment, the British Empire, the colonizers decided to veer towards it, especially as of 1931, when the Greek Cypriots rose against. It was the first anti-colonial movement. And there was the Cypriotizing policy, especially in education, but impacting in publishing and all aspects of managing the island. This resulted in this Cypriotization, made them kind of revert back to and fix on the idea that the Cypriots are now neither Greek nor Turkish, but they are Cypriot loyal subjects. And this gave way for fear of de-ethnicization, both for the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, and it gave way for them to hold on to their Greekness and Turkishness. And there is still that fear, because there is also that being stuck in the decolonial moment, because if we are not Turkish and if we are not Greek, then what exactly are we? What is the Cypriot identity if it is not Greek or Turkish? And this is, like I said, triggered by British colonialism and that ambiguity and that play, that game that I've already said, that is comical when you look at the archives that I've mentioned. And then, of course, particularly that moment when they worked so hard to create that policy and the impacts it had on the education to Cypriotize the Cypriots. And Cypriots, the people of Cyprus, are very much stuck in that moment of decolonialism, and hopefully soon somehow we will be able to get out of it. So yeah, thank you. So do I pass on to someone?
Yeah, to Elida now.
Elira, yes, Elira.
Yeah, just to answer that question, I would like to link it to how we can tackle racism in Cyprus, since that is the other coin of racialization. And I think what I find limiting in talks about how we tackle racism in Cyprus is that we do tend to focus on a Eurocentric perspective, that is why we are racist. But racism isn't innate, it's learned behavior that is tied to history. And our history, however you choose to identify yourself now, is not a European history. So the institutional racism that we have till this day in Cyprus does not stem from a European history of racism. It does not stem from colonization. It does not stem, meaning that we have colonized. It does not stem from us embarking on slave trades. There were slave trades in Cyprus, but it was not done by Cypriots. It was done by the colonial powers that had Cyprus at the time. It does not stem from these facets, so we cannot use rhetoric and conversation in Europe and in America about how to tackle racism in a Cypriot context. We need to look at the post-colonial world, because there is racism in the post-colonial world, and see their solutions and how they're tackling it, and really come from a place of that we were subjugated by the English on a racial basis. We were racialized, we were subjugated. So how can we now do the same things to immigrants coming into Cyprus from similar historical perspectives from ours? Most of them come from the post-colonial world. Most of them come from the Middle East, from a partitioned division. How can we then subjugate those people in ways that we were subjugated ourselves? I'm just looking at, as Yota Dimitriou said, we aren't post-colonial. I agree with Bakriyer's perspective that we're still in the stage of going out of colonialism. But in a legal sense, we are a recognized post-colonial country. We're getting immigrants from other post-colonial countries. How are we then subjugating them in ways that we were subjugated, and in the ways that Cypriots are subjugated when they leave Cyprus and they go to Europe? I think that's where the conversation needs to begin, so that we can tackle the issue of racism in Cyprus.
Great, thank you, Elida. All right, this is our final question, and I'm keeping track of those I'm seeing in the chat. Keep them coming, and we'll get to what we can. So this is for those who identify as women on our panel. Many argue that women experience racialization differently from men because they have the Western beauty standard imposed upon them. What has been your experience in this regard? And how, as Cypriot women, do we effectively push back against this? And Elida will be kicking us off.
Hi, it's me again. I think I was really interested in the term Anthony quoted from before called racial puberty, and the idea of, that you understand racialization when you go to puberty. And I think racial puberty is very gendered because it's different going through that as a man and maybe being seen as more aggressive, as an attacker versus as a woman. But I think it also, when you go through racial puberty as a woman, you do start questioning those binaries, I think, in a different way. So I've been seeing in the comment section, how do Cypriots in Cyprus identify, especially Greek-speaking Cypriots like myself, who do form the majority and have vast economic and political power in the country. And I think one of the ways that racialization sneaks into Cyprus, despite the fact that we are the majority, is that we all own a mirror. We know what we look like, and we know what Europeans look like on TV. We know what Americans look like on TV, white Americans. We know what the beauty standard is, and we, on the most part, do not fit the Eurocentric beauty standards. There are women as young as 13 getting keratin in their hair to straighten it. Rhinoplastic surgery is very popular. women who are darker skinned are told not to go into the sun by their grandmothers and their mothers so that they don't get even darker. I know many Cypriot women living in Cyprus can relate to that point. And that is a process of racialization that, you know, I think it affects Greek-speaking Cypriot women in a specific way, because we are supposed to look like Greek women. We are supposed to be producing Greek children. Why don't we look the way that Cypriot men want us to look? And there's also the sense of, you know, in Cyprus, there are the Greek-speaking Cypriots are the majority, but there are, you know, British expats, there are Eastern European women, there are, you know, it's always funny to me how Greek-speaking Cypriot women are especially shocked when they find out that Turkish-speaking women are fairer than them in certain parts of Cyprus. And I think that's a specific form of racialization that women go to, is the awareness that there are a fairer women in Cyprus that do not fit the partition divide. There are fairer Armenian women, fairer Turkish-speaking Cypriot women, fairer Maronite women, and that we ourselves do not look the way we are expected to look. Just to close like my thoughts on that, I think like a great way to familiarize yourself with that would be to look at modeling competitions in Greece, specifically the entrance of Spirula Kaiser, a Cypriot model of Greek-speaking descent, she's a Greek-speaking Cypriot model, who went to the competitions and was told, you look like a beautiful Muslim woman, you look like a beautiful Persian woman, and was very heavily othered and orientalized by the Greek judges. And I think that is a brilliant moment of Cypriot womanhood in kind of trash popular TV that really spoke to me and how I navigate my Cypriotness. Bakri, I think I pass it on to you.
Yeah. So I think I'd like to actually thank Ilaira when responding to this question, because so I've spent a lot of my years researching on the case of Cyprus, and Ilaira, when we first met a couple of months ago, and she interviewed me and she asked me a question about Cypriot women and the post-colonial experience, or the colonial experience and the partitioned experience. And I didn't really have an answer, because I realized that, as in most post-colonial partition cases, the women's question is always pushed aside. Even though women are doubly colonized, that question has been pushed aside. And I also, as a woman, have been guilty of this, where I focus so much on identity politics, I forgot about the woman question, or put that aside. So I'd like to thank Ilaira, because since then I've started to think about it quite a lot. And I've realized that it's always been a part of my life. I've always been, and I'm a part of numerous women's groups, and I've done so many projects. I've published another book called Nicosia Beyond Barriers with a group of women, but never actively thinking about it. In terms of the response to this question, I have to say I still kind of struggled with responding. When it comes to me responding to the woman question, I do struggle. I can't figure out why, but I do. And my answer to this would be to thinking of, I think about it in terms of the interrelation between my name and the performing body, as related to my experience here in the UK, growing up in a very white area in Essex, and being the only different thing, I guess. And I was made to feel like that different thing. And that process of, I've been speaking to quite a lot of women in the East Mediterranean, and I'm part of a lot of projects with a group of women. And we've very much been thinking about the ways in which we lose our names throughout processes and ways in which we lose our names. I just want to give you an example of how I found that I lost my name whilst growing up in the UK, and how I effectively pushed back against this through at this age, claiming my name. So what do I mean by this? My first day at school, I was four, I think it was. And I remember the teacher said, the teacher did the register, Sarah, Rebecca, Jack, John, and then at my name there was a pause, and the teacher asked me if she could call me Barbara. And I said, no, my name's Bahriye. And then I'm 4. The teacher asked me, can I call you Barbie? And I said, no, my name's Bahriye. Third time, can I call you Bari? And by then I was scared and I accepted. So my name became Bari throughout my primary school and secondary school. That transitioned into Barry. So my name was Barry. My other names that I also, and I was very embarrassed of Bahriye. Bahriye has also got, it's an Ottoman roots, as you probably noticed from the Niki Marango poem. Kitabi Bahriye is the book of navigation and the book of the sea, constructed by Pirireis, the Ottoman cartographer. And I was embarrassed of this name because of its Ottoman links and my link to this, the Ottoman Empire. So there was this element of being embarrassed there. Also, my surnames, Fındık is hazelnut. In Cyprus, surnames are linked to your physical body. And this brings me to thinking about the physical body. And my 2 surnames from my mum's side was Fındık, hazelnut, meaning a small person. And then the other was Karabıyık, a black moustache. So obviously the men and women of Cyprus, of the family, had the black moustache. So all of this made me feel very embarrassed about the names that I carried. And then with the performing body, it also links to that. And again, at school plays, for example, I wanted to be Juliet, but it was saying Romeo and Juliet, but it was only the blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls that could be Juliet. I was people like Medusa, or I remember there was a play called Wiley and the Hairy Man. Wiley was actually Jessie J, and Hairy Man was me, and I ate Jessie J, Wiley. And so in short, I guess what I'm veering towards is that I was embarrassed of this performing body and the names that I carried, but I've got to the point where I claim these names. I claim to be a proud, small, hairy woman of the sea. So I guess that would be my answer to the question. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you, Fadia. Yeah, and I don't think my name's that complicated. A lot of cultures have it, but I once worked somewhere where they called me Ariel. Then they said, oh, like the mermaid from Disney. And then it just became Diz. So from Ariana to Diz.
I would have taken Ariel though. I wouldn't mind being her.
Okay, so there is a question in particular that we've gotten in the chat that I want to make sure gets addressed. A few people have backed it up, underscoring that we definitely need to talk about this. So I will kick this off to anyone on the panel who wants to take it. And then I'm going to let you all know that I usually like to keep things right on time. So if anyone needs to leave right at half the hour, feel free. But we are going to do this question, then a few readings, and then questions as time allows and people are interested in staying on. So this question comes from Sage Stefanou, who identifies they, them. The question is, I feel a sense of otherness and unbelonging within my Cypriot identity as a queer and trans person. I wonder how other queer and trans Cypriots feel at the complex intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and faith. There is a colonial binary violence that still exists within the Cypriot community, and this feels pertinent to the conversation. Who would like to respond to that?
I can try. I mean, it's a very nuanced and great question. Thank you for posing it to us. I think, speaking again as a Cypriot from Cyprus, but I know these things carry on into the diaspora, racialization and the gender binary as it is in Cyprus is very entwined. I've talked before about how women are racialized and gendered, but men themselves have a very distinct racialization process of being either aggressors or being the protectors of the post-colonial world. And I think that can be very oppressive for non-conforming identities because they are forced into binaries that are doubly enforced through racialization and doubly enforced through the legacy of colonialism. I mean, many far better theoreticians than I have talked about how the impotence that men feel through racialization forces them to become doubly aggressive, doubly hard, doubly strong, and press down on their masculinity. And I think this has such a negative and detrimental effect to non-binary people, trans people, gay people, lesbians, anyone who doesn't fit the binary that exists in Cyprus, because they are seen as betraying the Cypriot masculinity and how Cypriot femininity is supposed to complement Cypriot masculinity. And that is a post-colonial binary. And going back to what I was saying before, because we don't address our colonial history, these things remain in the margins and are never truly discussed in their roots and how they are displayed in our society. I mean, I would like to remind everyone that being trans in Cyprus is still not technically legal. Being gay in Cyprus, it is legal, but you cannot marry in a church. You have to have a civil union marriage. And people who embark on these identities and these journeys in Cyprus are forced into a very difficult closeted life. And that is tied into racialization, and that is tied into colonization. And I think that's why we need to focus on these histories and how it's affected the voices of Cyprus further in order to deal with these complicated issues.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything to add from the panel?
Yeah, Elera, that was fantastic. I completely agree. And I think, just like I was saying earlier with the women's question being pushed aside, I've also felt very much about the LGBTQIA+ question also being pushed aside. And it enables the case of Cyprus to be addressed within a whole alternative narrative that really moves beyond the dominant narrative. And I'd just like to share that I co-created a project with a group of Cypriots and did a call asking during the LGBT month in February. I did a call for narratives, poetry, prose related to this topic, and we received 100 entries within 3 days. It was just a quick call, and that 100 entries became an e-zine. And there's 40 poets with a total of, I'd say, about 100 entries. That is an e-zine that I'm happy to put in the chat box if you'd like to. And there you see the voices of Cyprus within the UK, within Cyprus, from Australia, from America, that have collectively produced an alternative Cyprus that is genius. That I was just fascinated by the kind of Cyprus that was created through those narratives. So I'd be very happy to share that if you'd be interested. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. It sounds like there is interest, so feel free to drop that in the chat if you can, Badia, and we will also share that in our follow-up resources. So now we will shift over to another reading, followed by more of your questions. So please keep the questions coming and we'll do our best to answer them. So let's talk about the role that poetry and literature play in the evolution and or perpetuation of race-based distinctions in the context of Cypriot identity. I believe Badia will be doing a reading, followed by Daniele.
Sorry. Yeah. So just to kind of quickly respond to the question as well, to say that literature plays a crucial role in the evolution of racial distinction, both in terms of shaping it as well as disrupting it. So there's a lot of ethno-nationalist literatures, particularly linked to the 1950s and 1960s, like Kostas Montis, Claire Angelides, Özker Yashin, Süleyman Uluçemgil, who it's very much about an ancient Greek, producing an ancient Greek spirit in relation to the case of Cyprus, so a Greek Cyprus, and then its complete opposite, the Ottoman blood pouring in to create this kind of Turkish Cyprus. But then subsequently, from like post 1974, there's the partitioning, the Cypriotist narratives like Fikret Demirar's and Yorgos Maleskis, that's very much about a united Cyprus and a Cypriot identity that is inclusive of all of the layers. And this also figures with many of the writers of the diaspora. So what I'd just like to do in terms of the reading is I'd like to focus on a nationalist writer, an ethnic nationalist writer, a Greek Cypriot ethnic nationalist writer. And I'd like to, it's a tribute to Claire Angelides or Claire Angelidou, who passed away on the 1st of April 2021, so recently. Claire Angelides, to me, I identify with her as my Cypriot nationalist grandmother from the other side. So I have my grandmother, I have a grandmother from the north side who's had really negative experiences, and she is my grandmother from the south side who I really do feel connected to. Even though when we first met and I interviewed her, she felt a bit uncomfortable with my presence. But Claire Angelides was born in 1938 in Famagusta. She's published mostly poetry and some prose, starting in and around the 1960s through to her passing. Her works record the EOKA struggle. It also records the failing moments of independence and the traumatic experiences of 1974 partition. Angelides is considered the pioneer of the Greek Cypriots 1974-1990 generation, but the more nationalist perspective of it. And I also, her work very much resonates for me with the 1955 generation as well. I'm particularly drawn to her works, Vulnerable Lady the Sea, Pentadactylos My Son, The Mirror of the Soul, and all of her work, like I said, negotiates with that the anti-colonial experience and holding on to the Greekness of Cyprus. She served in the liberation struggle of EOKA, and she was the leader of the women's group in Carpathia. And after independence, she served as Ministry of Education and shaping the dominant narrative of Cyprus to an extent. So I will read a couple of beautiful poems by her. So the first one is from Vulnerable Lady the Sea, Kyrenia Ship. It is fortunate that the Kyrenia ship was found, a living reminder, eternally, of the voyage of beauty on the Aegean Sea between Rhodes and Cyprus. The second short one I'll read, A Fairy Tale. We come from very far, holding the kills, the words, the Greek words, and the heart of Nimosine. We walked on the rocks, and when we reached the shore, we landed with our children, our women, our fathers. We built strong houses with our small rafts. We improvised our lives, and we said, these shores are our shores. We plied the sea and traveled to all the nearby islands. On the shells, we wrote myths and history, the history of the Mediterranean. And then finally, I'd just like to, I really want to read and end with this poem, Last Words. And I'd just like to hold up this as I'm reading, which is my grandmother's key from her home in Kofino, prior to her uprooting from Kofino to Lefkonigo. She held on to her keys, and Angelides was uprooted and displaced from Famagusta and never returned to her home. So last words. And this is in the education that the children of Cyprus study. Last words. Hide the key. It's the houses. When you return, you can open it. Hide it somewhere, and from time to time, clean it so it doesn't rust. You can return. As soon as this is said, it should be ready. I double lock the door. Listen, I double lock the door, so you must pull it. Don't forget, you must pull it. I won't be returning as I calculated. You will go. You will again see the garden and the walnut tree that I watered. Be careful with the key. Our small garden will smell of yasmins. The vines will have brought fruit. They haven't pruned for a couple of years. So when you go, remember to bring Minas to prune the vine. Yes, and don't forget the basil. Don't cry. Don't cry. Just hide the key. If you lose it, do you know the difficulties that you will face when you return to the city? Where will you find a locksmith to change the locks? Thank you. And I'd just like to say that this is my grandmother. So that's her key. My grandmother has passed. So I've lost my Badia Kemal grandmother, and I've now lost my Claire Angelides grandmother. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Badia. And I see in the chat, all of us are moved by your words. Daniele will now be doing a reading for us. And then if there are any other questions, you can drop them in the chat. And I also want to say we kicked off by everyone saying where geographically they're calling in from today, but especially with what Badia just shared, as you feel so moved, please feel free to share where you or your family, your ancestors are from in Cyprus or otherwise, however you identify. In the chat, it would just be nice to know that as well, as people feel comfortable doing so. And Daniele, take it away.
Thanks, Oriana, and Badia, thank you so much for that moving tribute to both Claire and Yonene. Badia, I think that was wonderful and a real privilege for all of us to hear that. So thank you very much, and rest in peace to Claire. In preparation today, I thought I would bring some of our discussion into conversation with other contexts across the world, resonating what's many of us have already said today. I think it's important to think transnationally, to think globally, to think about connections between other parts of maybe the post-colonial world, and as Elida was rightfully saying, we can put pressure on that term. Maybe it's the decolonizing world. And so to that end, I wanted to just quote a little bit of material by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a preeminent African-American writer and theorist and activist, writing at the turn of the 19th and the 20th centuries. He's most famous for his text, The Souls of Black Folk, where he outlined ideas like double consciousness, for instance, the idea of kind of speaking from two different positions at the same time, which I think is important for us to think about and to explore, but also perform that reading without co-opting his ideas that are specifically rooted in the African-American experience. It's about having these kind of conversations transnationally without speaking over the experiences of other people. Today I wanted to read a little bit of material from another text of his, a shorter kind of essay called The Souls of White Folk, given that we're talking about race, we're talking about whiteness, we're talking about Eurocentricity. And some context, and it's a piece of academic writing, but I think he writes with this beautiful poetic way, and that's why I'm kind of almost performing it like a piece of poetry. This was first composed, as I understand it, in 1920. So there's these kind of resonances of the First World War, what was happening in particular on the fields of Belgium, but specifically he's talking about actually he's talking about the history of Belgium several decades earlier, the history from the 1880s onward, where the Emperor of Belgium, Leopold II, was complicit in war crimes in the Congo, what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Up to 15 million people died at the hands of that Belgian colonizer. This is why it's so important for us to think about this colonial history and our relationship with that. And this figure, his war crimes led to the term crimes against humanity being coined. That was in 1890 about him because of genocide in the Congo. And W.E.B. Du Bois is thinking about that, he's writing about that, he's doing so in 1920, what's happening in Europe in 1920. So when I'm reading this aloud, I think in double ways. Belgium laughed. The cities were happy, art and science flourished. The groans that helped to nourish this civilization fell on deaf ears because the world around about was doing the same sort of thing elsewhere on its own account. As we saw the dead dimly through the rifts of battle smoke, and heard faintly the cursings and accusations of blood brothers. We, darker men, said, "This is not Europe gone mad. This is not aberration or insanity. This is Europe. This seeming terrible, this seeming terrible is the real soul of white culture, stripped and visible today."
Thank you very much, Daniele. That was very powerful. And we had another question. What kind of solutions are there in terms of Cypriot identity to the Cyprus problem of a divided island? And this question came from George Evianu. Who would like to take that question? You know, it's a simple one.
Since Dakia, do you want to take it?
Well, I guess I would say the solution from our part, what we can do is acknowledge and address the competing narratives. So, like I've said this before and several times, but it's acknowledging the pain from the other side, and that there's common ground in terms of the pain. So, just like with the key example, like the Angelides has been uprooted and hasn't been able to return to her home, and similarly, my grandmother hasn't as well. So just seeing the competing narratives, but at the same time, these competing narratives have common ground. And I think it comes from, for me personally, I really do think it's literature and arts, because literature and arts is the voice of the people. It's the actual lived experiences that speaks truth to power, that speaks truth to the dominant histories. And even with nationalist narratives, like with Claire Angelides, her narrative is she's a hardcore nationalist, right? But when you read her poetry, it's the lived struggles and the lived experiences. So I would say the solution is literature and arts. That's the power, and that's the way forward, because that's the voice of the people.
Yeah, I kind of would agree, particularly as a writer, I would agree with that as well. I'd probably say one other thing that maybe we can all do, those of us who aren't writers, academics, artists, and so on, and that is to embrace the Cypriot identity. And that means that we lose this idea of being Greek or being Turkish. You know, we lose that prefix, because I think that's for a lot of the time what confuses everything, and it draws us away from each other. One of the things when you study history, you realize that it was very much in the British's intention to try and re-Hellenicize the island, because of the fact that they didn't know who these people were. And as I said before, because you couldn't impose religion on a predominantly Christian group of people, their justification for staying there was they're a hybrid group of people. And the way that we're going to sort that out is to reintroduce or re-Hellenify the island, to take it back to how the Mycenaeans had it 2,500 years ago. And I kind of feel that from the 1950s onwards, the idea of being a Greek Cypriot or a Turkish Cypriot or Armenian Cypriot was all designed to divide and rule. And I think what we can do as individuals is refuse those terms. And if you're going to use them, one of the things that we use in this group, one of the things that is used throughout academia, is Greek speaking or Turkish speaking, in the way that you have a lot of Latin America, they'll say Spanish speaking countries. Arabs are a linguistic group of people, as Daniele was saying earlier. It's not a race of people. The Arabs would have come from Arabia, but obviously you've got, you know, people such as the Lebanese and the Palestinians and the Egyptians that speak different kinds of Arabic. So I kind of feel that if Cypriots start to see themselves in that way and identify in that way, it starts to undo the work of nationalism, which is about dividing people and keeping them in their camps in this kind of tribal mentality. But as we've just shown, we come from a very long lineage of many different groups of people, and it's about embracing all of that, not fixating on Greece and Turkey, but looking at everything that happened in between those spaces as well, and saying we are also part of the Persian, the Byzantine, the Venetian, the Moors, the Egyptians, you know, the Persians, everyone is within us. And I kind of feel we have to accept and embrace that. And that's how, as a group of people, we move forward and come together.
Thank you, Anthony. That's great. Anyone else? I'll also field this one. Okay, so I would just say, I just came up with this. It's pretty simplistic, but adopt an intolerance for identity-based division and hatred. And I say this in the context as an urban planner. I do a lot of things. I help publish poems in all the languages of Cyprus to help spur peaceful thinking, but I'm an urban and regional planner. I do this at a local government level here in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore region. And I also lecture at a university with graduate students studying planning. And our built environment is very personal. Many students who I work with, I work with them when they're doing their thesis projects, the culminating project for their master's. And there are always several students who look either at their hometown domestically or their ethnic home origin internationally. And this year we have a student of Armenian descent who is looking very closely at Artsakh. And for those of you who are aware, there is a conflict going on there right now. And I said to her, you know, I know you're of Armenian descent and you see things a certain way, although you're really expanding your mind. I see a lot of similarities between the plight of this place that is not acknowledged on an international level and the divisions in Cyprus and a lot of the challenges that you're facing. So she's looking at it from a resilience standpoint. She's looking at both disaster preparedness, but also war, and where there are case studies where we can, from a built environment standpoint, prepare this place for instances of catastrophe from a natural standpoint and from war. And so I asked her, you're thinking of this whole checklist of all of the infrastructure that has to be in place to make sure people are safe, the instances of earthquakes, the instances of fire. What about education? And I don't just mean when a school gets destroyed, how do you rebuild it? But how do you rebuild what is being taught there? How do you make sure that facts are being taught there? How do you make sure that the truth is being taught there? And she said, you know, I'm so ashamed to say that I don't know an Azeri. I've never met someone who is of descent from Azerbaijan, although this place is inhabited by those people. And I said, you know, there are many similar situations in Cyprus, and I really suggest that you take a look at that. So I just highlight that because it can feel very isolating, the situation that we have in Cyprus. But whether it's as direct a comparison as Artsakh or so many places around the world, we just have to remember that we're not alone and that we have to empower ourselves by talking with everyone that we know about it and listening to everyone we know about their own situations. So I think that's something that we can all do no matter what we do for work. That's just part of our lifestyle. So thank you all. And another question we got, I see we still have 66 people with us. So, you know, as you start dropping off, we'll take that as a sign that you don't want to hear us anymore. But the next question came from Christina, and it was, I don't know if she was, or if Christina was expecting a response from the panel on this, but it was just, is there sometimes too many labels in trying to identify ourselves that we lose our core? And I know this comes up many times, you know, the multiplicity versus the unity of identifying simply as Cypriot versus all the other ways we identify. Who would like to take that?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think sometimes when talking about Cyprus, especially in my attempts to look at it from a non-Eurocentric historic way, I do think of pan-Arabism, because that was a suggestion that, you know, all Arabs, no matter where they come from, what country they come from, what ethnicity they are Arabs. And that is a unification, that is a unified thing. And funnily enough, the man who wrote the book on pan-Arabism was an Arab from Egypt and Lebanon called Yorgos Andoniou, which I think just fractures everything we think about the cliches of identity. I don't know, sometimes I completely agree that we should embrace the Cypriot identity in all its multiplicity, much like, Pan-Arabism, but I'm also aware of the intricacies and the nuances of doing that and the complications of moving from very, very entrenched, violent binaries that we have in Cyprus now to we're all Cypriots. I want to get to that place, but I'm conscious of how to get there. So I think debating how many identities we have, the multi-plethora of identities, the multi-consciousness of those identities, is a good way of navigating that very difficult process that, Anthony said this in one of our preparations to this. He said, like, the English didn't know what to do with us. They made one decision, like, let's Hellenize the island, and we're still talking about it hundreds of years later. And I think that was a really nuanced observation that, what the divisions and the partitioned lines that England has done all over the post-colonial world, all over the Commonwealth, is still something that we're navigating and debating, not just in Cyprus, but in Pakistan, in India, in Kashmir, in Palestine, in Lebanon. When you take out the British colonialism and include French colonialism, we're not alone in this questioning about whether we have too many identities or whether we don't know which identity to look at. So I think connecting with the post-colonial world is vital in trying to find a unified identity that unites us all and trying to make sense of what Cypriotness is and if it can stand the weight of a unified identity. So that's my attempt at an answer.
Yeah, and I just thanks Ilera. I think that's fantastic, and I completely agree. And I'd just like to add that I tend to veer away from using the term identity, and instead I like to use the term, just like Ilera pointed out and Ariana, about other conditions that have common grounds with the case of Cyprus, or similarities with the case of Cyprus, thinking about Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy's definitions of identity as related to the post-colonial diaspora from the Caribbean in particular, but the post-colonial diaspora generally within the UK. And it's not, they veer away from identity and instead they use the term identification. So identity is the name we give to different ways in which we position ourselves. So then we can have multiple different ways from which we position ourselves. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about identity that is not fixed. And I find that helpful. And I definitely recommend these two authors to kind of unpack this further. So yeah.
Thank you so much. And you have all been so patient with us as we've gone a lot longer than planned. We will now be concluding with a poetry reading from Elida. And if you have any closing thoughts, please feel free to share them in the chat, along with any questions, any resources you want to share. And take it away, Elida.
Thank you. Before I read the poem, I see a disgruntled George in the comment section, and I would just like to say, if your questions haven't been addressed in this Zoom, please send it to us over Instagram. We will have, or any of our social medias. We will happily answer them. We wish we could answer every question, but obviously all of the questions are so complicated and nuanced that we try and dedicate much detail to them. But I don't want anyone to feel ignored, so please ask us in our socials, and we will answer you there. Sorry, George, for being aired. So the poem is Wartime by Mehmet Yashin. It deals with the hybridity of the Cypriot position, and I think it's a very beautiful poem. I used to talk within myself so that no one could hear me, and they all suspected wisdom in my silence. Turkish was dangerous, must not be spoken, and Greek was absolutely forbidden. My elders who wanted to save me were waiting, each one trigger ready before a machine gun. Anyway, everyone was then a willing soldier. English remained right in the middle. A slender paper knife for cutting school books, a tongue to be spoken at certain times, especially with the Greeks. I was often unsure in which language to shed tears. The life I lived wasn't foreign, but one of translation. My mother tongue one thing, my motherland another, and I, again, altogether different. Even in those days of blackouts, it became obvious I could never be the poet of any country because I belonged to a minority. And freedom's still a little word uneasy in any nation's lexicon. Then in my poems, the three languages got into a wild tangle. Neither the Turks nor the Greeks could hear my inner voice, nor the others. But I don't blame them. It was wartime.
Thank you very much, Elida. Thank you all so much for your contributions to this robust conversation tonight. We will be circling back soon with the recording and all resources that were shared and referenced today. And we'll be in touch soon about what our next topic will be. But thank you all again so much. Have a restful remaining Sunday evening and good, healthy, peaceful week ahead. Take care.